on some of these barns that are sitting on flat ground, there might be 100 whiskey bottles under it.
Someday people will be gutting these houses that have been redone in the last 20, 30 years, and the walls are full of PBR cans. Most people who know your name will probably remember that, like, you're the guy that found the big old mastodon tusk, right?
They're all over the place. They're right past the ends of your boots. My grandpa wanted to keep farming. His other siblings had moved away, and they had designs on, financial gain. All got lawyers together. All those lawyers played golf with each other, and they came out the other end with very little. That has always loomed pretty large in my life. It took me 8 years to propose to her for some reason, but
Family owned a whole bunch of ground, and it still took you 8 years.
yeah, it still took me 8 years. I wanted her to be good and sure that I was what she wanted. I'm surprised somebody didn't find her in the plat book, to be honest with you. But
In this episode, you're going to learn a lot about prairie history. We're going to hear about not just the prairie plants, but the animals that used to live on it, as well as the people that used to live on it and what they did with it. We have somebody who's in studio today who's kind of an expert in a lot of unique topics about the Midwest and American history, and especially when it comes to barns. So settle in for a really unique conversation here on Land Your Ground. Welcome to another episode of Land Your Ground. This is episode 15, and with me today I have a special guest, Judd McCullum, who's joining me to talk about a lot of things in American history, barns in particular, and some other really cool stuff that we used to have a lot more of around this area, and maybe not so much these days. But if you have heard some of the other podcasts that Judd has been on, you're no stranger to how interesting this conversation might get. But I'm excited to have Judd in studio today, and I appreciate you coming to join us.
I'm excited to be here.
The first time I think we met, I was thinking back about this a little bit. Somebody suggested your name to me. I'd heard you on the Working Class Bowhunter podcast, and as people might notice in the background of some of the videos here, they're just like, we're rustic material enthusiasts. So we've been building a lot, doing a lot of cool stuff like that in the last few years, and using a lot of reclaimed materials. And somebody's like, "Do you know Judd?" I was like, "Who's that?" And they said who you were, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I saw him on a podcast." And anyway, so we got in touch about some barnwood, and next thing I know, I'm like, I think I really like this guy.
Yep.
So tell everybody, our guest here, what it is. Tell us about what you do. What's your day job, Judd?
So my day job, my elevator pitch is I work for a company called Barnstormers Wood, and we sell everything from single boards to almost dried in structures, homes, businesses, whatever that may be. And we source the frames for those structures from antique timber frame barns from the 19th, 18th, and recently, the 18th century, I think, is as far back as we go. 1751 is the earliest one I've taken down.
That's awesome.
Which was pretty neat.
Yeah.
But we've traveled all over the eastern portion of the country. The company has done work on the West Coast quite a bit, but that was before I joined.
Okay. Mostly like taking barns out there and
Yes.
Okay.
Taking barns down here in the Midwest and moving them to Washington, Oregon, a couple of California. But like I said, that was before I came along 13, 14 years ago. I've been at this. So I've traveled to Maine. I've put floors in Key West. Built a large lodge on a high fence operation in Texas. And then I think one of the bigger and younger barns I've done was in Valley City, North Dakota.
Really?
Or close to Valley City, North
You
Dakota.
took it down there, or you put it up?
I took it down, and we put it in storage for the client.
Gotcha.
But it was a monster, and it was all out of wood that's more common dimension for today than what you would have expected. It was all trucked back from the Pacific Northwest, I think, and they'd already started squeezing the dollars out of the lumber dimensions.
Sure. Yep. Shrunken the dimensions a bit.
Yeah.
For the sake of economy, I'm sure. And we definitely want to get into that, because I think it's super cool how the materials used in barns kind of is like a chronology about what wood and what kind of trees used to be available here in this part of the country and east, which is, I love that kind of stuff. But I was telling Jordan actually just here recently, I was telling him that I look at a lot of cool properties in my job, and I get to see some really, really neat things. And I would like to say that I don't get envious very often, but when I do, it's typically one of two things. It's either a really nice pond or a really cool old barn.
Yep.
And if I could grab either one of those someplace and put it here on my property, man, like I would like love old barns. We love seeing water and stuff too, obviously. So like ponds always, get me pretty jacked up when you see a really cool design pond or something that's got a lot of shoreline and islands, or just, there's so many cool things about them. But barns are just a piece of American history, and just, it's a cultural thing, I guess. When what old farmstead painting doesn't have an old red barn somewhere on the hillside?
Yep. Yep.
And I think when people think of rural living, they think about barns. And when we bought this piece of property, there was not a single building on it. And so many times I see old barns that are just kind of like they've been abandoned.
Yep.
They no longer serve a practical purpose for somebody. So they're just slowly decaying. And I drive by there and it's just like a little tear rolls down my cheek, because I'm just like, nobody appreciates you. It's like, if I could just go out and adopt all those barns and take them down and bring them home, like I'd have a barn museum out here. Jackie and I've talked about that before.
Oh, that'd be cool.
It's just, so I do get a little bit envious about some of these old barns, and I think it's awesome what you guys do, that, you get the phone call when somebody else is like, I got this barn that it's time, somebody needs to give it new life or whatever.
Yep.
And, so I guess let's talk about what areas you've done work in and what kind of barns you see, like in the Northeast or let's say the Southeast, or versus the Midwest. What was the barn architecture like, and what's different here than what you see elsewhere? And
Sure. So the barn I mentioned from 1751 is by far the oldest one that I've been a part of taking down, and it was in pretty close to Ogunquit, Maine, and it had been, the land that the barn was built on had been given to this same family that we worked for by the King of England at that time. And I don't know my history of the monarchy over there, so I can't tell you who it was, but some shipbuilders built this barn down close to the beach. At some point, it was drug up onto the hill to the location where we went to work on it, and it was built by shipbuilders. And there was a lot of different things in it, and also the way it was constructed. It was backwards to what we're used to. So when you approach a barn, if you can walk into it from one end or the other and look down the length of it, you'll see the components of the timber frame usually make kind of an H shape. And those are called bents. And so what would happen was you would stand up a pair of bents and put its girts in, which run long ways to the barn, and connect them and brace those off, and keep doing that until you've reached the full length of the barn, and then cap those with wall plates on top that run the length of the barn.
Yep.
So the way that this one was constructed was the bents ran the entire length, and then had tie beams that captured over top of those wall plates. And so when we got on site, the first thing we do is we soft strip the barn and get all the non-structural wood out of it, and then get the roof off as best we can, saving as much as we can. Sometimes if there were cedar shakes on it, it has to go in the dumpster, because there's nothing you can do with all those millions of tiny little nails that were in it. And so that comes off. And we got to the point where we were getting ready to dismantle the actual frame of the barn, and it gave me great pause. And it was my father-in-law and I, who owns the company, on this job, just the two of us. And it took a little bit of staring at this thing to figure out how it was going to come apart, because it was tied together lengthwise, I guess like a ship would be, and then captured by those widthwise components, the tie beams. So that is completely backwards to what you see pretty much everywhere else in the country. And even in the barns, I can't remember exactly how this went, between Cincinnati and Cleveland, Ohio. There was an embargo on shipbuilding and the shipping of the King's Wood, I think, during the War of 1812, I think.
Okay.
And so there's all these shipbuilders traveling from Cleveland to Cincinnati, or from Cincinnati to Cleveland, and as they traveled, they built barns. And so there's this whole strip of barns through that part of central Ohio that are extremely overbuilt.
Really?
Double knee braces everywhere. Those are the components that run at a 45-degree angle that keep it from racking. Then the wind bracing in these things is huge. The components are just oversized in general. They're not going anywhere. And they're kind of a bear to get apart because they were meant to just stand for absolutely forever. So those are really cool to go in and see, but they're built more traditionally in those with the bents and the wall plates, sort of style of assembly. But you get into that in central Ohio. In the southeast, it's a lot of tobacco barns.
Yep.
There's not a lot of structure to those. They usually have a ton of good siding on them because they can be, 2, 3 full stories tall for all of that space to hang the drying tobacco.
And they usually have more of like a straight roof line, don't they? Not as many gambrels or
not as many gambrels. Those are straight roofs. A lot of the big timber frames that you see from eastern Indiana, I would say through central Pennsylvania, like to have a straight roof line. And in some of those barns you'll see they'll use actual pole rafters, which is just a tree with one hewn flat side on it.
Right.
That goes all the way from the eave to the peak, which are really neat to take down and to look at, but they're not so much fun to install unless they're all meticulously labeled and you put the pairs back together and all that stuff because they're hand scribed basically into the wall plates and the mid rafter supports, which we call purlins.
they kind of go back together one way.
They go back together one way, and you can fight them back together, but it doesn't make for a flat roof. So we try to avoid that.
Yeah.
And then you start moving into Illinois, and Illinois is an interesting sort of a place because you had some really early settlers to Illinois coming in via the rivers. And a lot of people, when you picture westward expansion, you just think somebody starts out in Virginia and looks at the westward heading on their compass and just sets out and goes in a straight line. Well, it didn't happen that way. They all came down the Ohio River, hit Cairo, which wasn't there at the time, popped up shortly after, and started coming up the Mississippi rivers, the Illinois River, and things like that. And so all of the population of Illinois started along those rivers. And so, out on the big sand flats down around Effingham, northwestern Illinois, northern Illinois, those were all a lot later. They were settled later. So the barns are a lot newer. So what you'll see is the closer you get to a river, the older the barns are, the more likelihood you have of an original frame.
Really?
And the farther away you get and the more exposure they seem to get on the higher, flatter ground, you'll see barns that were built out of a much larger barn that got blown down in a storm sometime in the past. So it's kind of a running joke with all of us that do this barn work in Illinois that, they're just, if you find a timber frame, it's generally a cobbled mess just because they've taken whatever components they could that
Patchwork
weren't broken and reassembled something smaller out of, tenons that broke off or things like that. So,
wow. And
then even later you start getting, like I mentioned, all that wood being shipped from the Pacific Northwest or coming down from Wisconsin and being milled square.
Yeah.
And
so when did that roughly happen? So you mentioned some of just the round, what did you call it? Pole timber.
The pole rafters.
But at what point did most of it go from being hand hewn to you started to see some sawmills coming in where now you start seeing some of the circle sawn beams and some of that stuff?
So the circle saw mills, by probably 1890, you're going to start seeing a lot of circle sawn beams. There are some that were much earlier. And what a lot of people assume is, they used a big circle saw, and that was the first thing that any timbers were milled with. But they used to have these big frame saws, which were just a straight piece, just like a pit saw or this misery whip you've got up here above your door, the 2-man pull saw. But that was just put in a frame, and they would manually advance a log through it as this frame went up and
down vertically.
Water milled. So that was the first sawing. And those actually probably ran concurrent with hewing in the Northeast in some places.
We visited a mill down in Tennessee several years ago in the Smoky Mountains that was still using a water wheel to move a vertical saw like that to cut wood, and it was it's so cool.
That is cool.
But it was so you've seen barns that that many barns that were like all hand hewn beams, and then you've seen like probably what portion of our historic barns in the Midwest are still have any hand hewn in them versus like circle sawn or just rough sawn?
Some of them can be transitional, and I think some of that comes from availability of some of the timbers. Like you'll see later on, there weren't as many of the tall trees you needed to make the long wall plates.
Like 20 or 30 foot long wall plates,
or even longer. I think the longest beam, the largest beam we've ever shipped, went to Lake Forest, Illinois, and it was a 14 by 16 by 66 foot long.
What?
Piece of hickory.
Wow.
Now, if you can imagine a piece of hickory that you could hew a full dimension square-ish, they're never square architecturally, square-ish piece of wood for its entire length, the size of the tree that had to come out of.
Right.
Like, people will mistakenly think that they've got virgin forest on their property because it might have a couple of great big, like, open country yard oak trees on it or something like that. And they think, oh, that's never been logged. Well, that probably just didn't have too much of a value at the time.
Your white oak would not be shaped like a bush if it had grown in shade.
Right. So you have to imagine a forest that all grew together and is, it's got to be 100 feet tall. These trees, these poplars, these beech trees, hickories.
Yeah. Do you see much beech?
Yeah, a lot of beech through, like I said, eastern Indiana.
Yeah.
Through Ohio, western Pennsylvania. Lots of beech. It's a really nice wood to work with. Yeah. If you've got to do any restoration work to it, it's not real mean to your tools like white oak can be. But it's those are usually the biggest ones we see. We'll see some really big white oak timbers come out of as a carrier in a bank barn that's holding up the frame. But it's just hard to imagine, the size of these trees and what the timber framers had to feel when they came over and got off the boats and realized there were things to build with that were longer than 6 feet long, because you have to think how depleted Europe was.
Oh gosh.
And then you look at some of the photographs. Like there's a photograph in the general store down in Dehinda, Illinois, and it's of somebody standing. Let's see, this might be one from Canton, but it's of somebody standing in a creek, and it's kind of a wide shot for the time, but everything, there's not a plant in sight. Everything has been burnt or cut down for firewood. Everything has been taken down for building. I mean, the amount of erosion that had to happen had to be insane. Yeah. But you see all those photographs. There's nothing on the landscape, absolutely nothing, and it was that way around all the towns. Yeah. And to a certain extent around the farmsteads.
It was part of the same psychology that people just had back then, just like manifest destiny. They thought there was never going to be an end to the resource. That it didn't matter how much of it you cut, we're not ever going to run out of it. And just, same with the prairie, same with a lot of those types of features that, same with bison and white-tailed deer and everything else, that they thought this is a bottomless resource. Like we will never run out. So just use all that you feel the need to use, or, that it was put there for you specifically to make use of and advance your society. And it's interesting, to think like how far it had to get before somebody started looking around. It's like, wait a minute, I don't see any more American chestnut trees. Right. We might have a problem. It's like what few we had left, and then we get hit with blight. And
well, that had to be such a slow realization too. Like when you think, you've used all these resources to build up your homestead, and you've got an amount of cleared land now that you can farm, but just to look around yourself and there be nothing. That had to sink into most people, you would think. Maybe it didn't.
Yeah. But. No, you would think. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about the same time that people are, modernizing, like tools became more efficient. We went from, the 2-man saws and axes to fell these giant trees to more mechanized methods. And then as the railroad comes through and you have opened up a whole new market for it, because like, how fast can we use all these logs? Well, maybe not that fast here, but if we can haul them down the river and load them on something and then ship them somewhere, all of a sudden, let's cut as many as we can cut because we can sell them. Yep. And then, so back to the sawn frames, some of the original barns, were they generally heavier timber? Did you ever see like smaller dimensional stuff that was all hand hewn? Mm-hmm. Okay.
There's been a couple of barns I've been in that the 4x4 knee braces were all hewn.
Really?
Which just had to be maddening for layout.
I would think.
Guys had all the time in the world, and there were plenty of them working on these barns, I would imagine. Like when we go out, there's a crew of 4 or 5 guys, but back then, I don't know how many guys there might have been, but I know that when we pull up some of the floors on some of these barns that are sitting on flat ground, there might be 100 whiskey bottles under it. And that might be from the guys building it, or that might be from Grandpa going out to milk the cow and having a little nip and then dropping it down through a hole in the floor. But
I don't know. It makes you imagine what that job site might have been like.
It was probably pretty rough.
Oh, gosh. Modern equivalent of that. Someday people will be gutting these houses that have been redone in the last 20, 30 years, and the walls are full of PBR cans.
Yep, and Marlboro packs, yep.
Yeah, a bunch of skull cans laying under the floorboard somewhere.
Yep.
That's kind of what construction's in, probably like NOS and energy drink cans too.
Yep, a lot of Monster, yep.
Yeah. As we get further along into like late 1800s, early 1900s, now like the hand hewn is a thing of the past. Nobody's doing that anymore.
Yep.
Do you think that like the craftsmanship as a whole on the barns started to deteriorate at all at that point? Or was it like, no, these people still were like expert craftsmen. They just had better tools and they're putting them up faster or they're...
I think so. So I've taken down a handful of catalog barns, whether it be out of a Sears and Roebuck catalog or another one, but you can tell they're cut to fit on a train car. Oh. There's not a timber in it that's longer than, we'll say 24 feet, and even the components that should be running most of the length of the barn, they're only running from bay to bay, from post to post, and they're still maintaining a certain level of straightness. And the tolerances on those, we'd be surprised if they were an inch out of square and 100 running feet.
Wow.
It's just incredible, the craftsmanship, even if they were coming out of a quote unquote mass production sort of a situation. But they took pride in what they did.
Yeah. Pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty unique piece of history. And I know like there are still barns in Europe that are 800 or 1,000 years old, which is mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to go in a timber frame in Norway or someplace where there's a barn that's more than 500 years old. Like that would just impress me.
Yep.
And I think mostly just because like most of our barns here are not 130 to 140 years old or younger, and we're letting them all fall apart.
Yep.
Like, how are they keeping barns standing for 500 years? Like, because people care, I guess.
People do care.
It's they I think really grasped on to what an important part of their history those were, and they, I guess maybe they just convince each new generation of that and say like, these are something that you should cherish. These are historical landmarks. This one has been here for 5 generations in our family, and don't you be the one that lets it fall down.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
I don't know. It sounds like I'm that's kind of step on some toes. I'm not trying to, it's a little bit of a soft spot for me, in this area. Like I love all of our old buildings, are not just barns, like livestock barns, but some of the threshing barns and, whether it's down south, you're talking about the tobacco barns or the round barns that people put up here in the late 1800s or through about 1915 or so, where, they might have 60 head of dairy cattle that they were milking and feeding all at the same time in this giant round barn. Like, it was a really cool design that at the time was like built for efficiency. Well, now nobody does that anymore. The farmer that owns that land, you can't necessarily blame them for like, I have no use for that barn. You know how expensive it would be to, paint it, let alone put a new roof on it or do any of that stuff. It's like, why throw money at a building that no longer serves that practical purpose? And so those are like, we all understand why we let them go to crap.
Yep.
But it doesn't make me feel good about it.
No.
Personally, it's like, I got to do something, you know?
I think most of it just comes down to, they fall out of daily use. They might still be cared for, but, if you don't have somebody going in there every day and knowing what they're looking at and seeing maybe that termite tube that's coming up from the sill plate on a corner post, and catching that and, slathering some turpentine on that to take care of that problem, that can advance really quickly. Or you get a little bit of a metal corner popping up, and some water gets in there and runs down a rafter and hits a wall plate, and now your barn's split in half, basically. It's just little stuff like that if you're not in there and you're not looking at it and you're not moving around the whole structure, instead of just cracking a door open and getting some air to it and taking a look, people just aren't going to have the time in there to realize that something's going wrong.
Right.
Basically. So,
that makes sense. It's like the vehicle that you haven't driven for a month or something that sits in the shed.
yeah, the seals are going to start drying out in it. You know, you might have an oil leak, and then somebody decides they're going to throw a battery in there and crank it up and dry cylinders, and it's done for. You know?
Yeah. So as we think about barns that used to serve a lot more practical purpose, and then today people just aren't using them as much for those things. So what are some of the things that people are using these barns for?
So a lot of the ones I'm involved with fall in a window of being still in good enough shape and are well cared for that people want to keep them on the property. They want to keep all the insurances and liability and everything on them because they are in a certain shape to be able to stand for quite a while.
Okay.
And then on the other end of that spectrum is the ones where the wind has taken half of the roof off. It's leaning over at 10 degrees. Most of the siding's fallen off. You know, it's been exposed to the weather and the joinery's not tight anymore.
And they're trying to rescue what they can before it's a total loss type thing?
That sort of thing. But at that point, you know, if they don't want to get close to it, I don't want to get close to it. If it's not a stable thing, you know, it's maybe we can push it over and get some of the siding off of one side, you know, or maybe salvage a door or two that fell off the front. But there's not a lot we can do with that. So the barns that we work with fall in that sort of area. It might be have a swayed back where a tie beam's let go and the rafters are starting to splay in the middle, or you know, I've used this example before if somebody might have heard it, but there was a couple down in Canton. They had a really nice, immaculate 10 by 10 posts and components, white oak sawn frame. And it was in great shape. There was no water intrusion. I couldn't find any evidence of any bugs. They were in it every now and then. They had some storage in there, and they were moving things in and out. And they called me up, and they said, we want to know if this is in good enough shape that we can leave it stand for our retirement, or do we need to take it down now and deal with it while we still are earning a wage and have the means to do that. So I went down and looked at it, and it was, like I said, it was immaculate. It was in great shape. And I said, here's what we're going to do. You don't have to worry about, you know, it falling down, because it was almost like brand new. It was like it was built yesterday. I said, I'll come back in 5 or 6 years because I want to build a house out of this, and I'll buy it from you, and we'll proceed that way. We'll just be in touch. I mean, I drive by it, you know, a couple times a month.
Yeah,
I'll keep
they weren't
an eye
in a hurry
on it.
to do something with it. You told them it was.
I told them I'd have a use for it, and about 2 years later, there was an electrical fire and it burnt to the ground.
Oh, you laugh or cry. So
Yeah.
I don't want to cry on camera. So
It's one of those, yeah.
that's horrible. Yeah, heartbreaker.
It is.
So there was a barn that was kind of between here and where Jordan's from, that my wife's great grandpa built, and we used to drive by it, and so cool, really beautiful, big red barn. And I think they used to raise I think it was Percherons or Morgans, maybe one of the two there. So, you know, it was a pretty good sized barn. They were breeders, and they raised draft horses in it in the late 1800s. And there was one time where the property, there used to be a bigger farm. Then years ago, it became just the house with a couple acres in this barn. And there was a point in time when it sold. And we actually talked about it for a couple of days. It was like, oh, we should just buy the place just to have the barn, and then maybe take it down and do something with it later, you know, bring it to different property or whatever. But we didn't. So we missed, you know, there was a blip in time where maybe there was a chance we could have or should have done something with it. And then we're just like, just hopefully the next people keep it up, because up until that point it had been really well maintained, and it was still beautiful and looked structurally sound or whatever. And then just several years ago, this might've been 4, 5, 6 years ago, something like that, big windstorm came through, blew it over and just flattened it. And I mean, it went from looking like it was in really good shape to all of a sudden it's not there anymore. How many storms, how many big derecho, straight line winds had come through that area over the 130-ish years that the thing stood. Who knows? But it just took one coming from the right angle that put it on its side and no more.
And probably a lot of bugs too.
Yeah, probably. Because as you drive by, there's a lot probably there. It looks solid. The siding's still in good shape. Somebody kept painted, but who knows? Powder post beetles or termites or something get into one side and weaken the structural integrity somewhere that it just didn't have, the guts to hold up to that wind. But it's it happens. But so some of these old barns that people are salvaging material from or whatever, what are we doing with it? Like, where's it going? You mentioned flooring. You do a lot of flooring, right?
Yes, do a lot of flooring, do a lot of wall coverings like you've got here, chair rails, just anything that you can make out of barnwood. We'll handle. We'll have to share a picture of our floor in our house somewhere here during this podcast, because that's material that came from you guys and it's beautiful. We absolutely love it. I don't know, there's 5 or 6 different species I think in it, and 3 or 4 different widths, which looks nice. That was hard to put down. I don't know how many of them you do that are like that, but it came out really good and we're super excited about it. The stairs just finally got wrapped up too, and it's such a cool look, unique material that you just it's not you're literally looking at history, which is what we love about it. If I can get the metal out of it in a cost-effective and time-efficient way, we will reuse it. Going back to that roof sheathing that had cedar shakes in it, it's garbage. I've tried to denail that stuff. Can't get it all out. Not going to happen. So, like loft floors, granary walls, granary floors, stall walls. Let's see what else. Some of my favorite boards are the ones that are heavily cribbed and just worn down in weird shapes by the Jackie loves that too. We have one board that we still haven't found a place to use it yet, but it's all cribbed. I mean, it looks like a kid drew the sea, just looking down the edge of the board. And it's got so many chew marks on it from probably like over a 50-year span. You can tell some of them are a lot older than others and whatever. And, it's just cool to see like evidence of how a board served its purpose. Which is neat. But do you deal like what are some of the tree species that you most commonly see? Most commonly your oaks, like I said, beech, poplar. I'm gonna forget a big one. Hickory's a big one. We try not to do flooring out of hickory because even reclaimed hickory will move quite a bit. Ash is the same way. Really? Okay. Not a lot of chestnut. Everybody who we would source chestnut from has this impression that each board is worth $1 million. It feels like that. You can get into some spots where it's not rare at all. You just have to have the know-how to make it usable, I guess. So we don't jump up and down too much over chestnut. I like the look of it, but I don't find that it's too different from a nice patinaed white oak to go out of your way for, I guess. That's just my personal opinion of it. But that's cool. Some of the nicest wood, my favorite wood that I've ever worked with, has come out of hog houses that were built in the 60s and 70s. What? Yeah. Somebody dragged a mill up and they cut down those big old yard oaks from out back of the farm and milled up the stall walls that are absolutely just caked in the feed and all the evidence of hogs living in there. You throw 200-degree water at that at about 3,500 psi, and it takes a lot of the smell out of it. It makes it it's beautiful. I can't tell you how beautiful it is, and there's usually no smell to it, even before you finish it. It's really interesting that none of that really soaks into the wood, but that's cool. You get this. There's a really thick feed crust that gets on there that you've got to pressure wash off, and once you get that down to that and you kind of skip playing the circle marks off of it, the wood's just got this great patina to it, and it's like dark chocolate, and it's usually really curly because it's from big trees. And I don't know a man that has ever cut like old oak and not thought that it was one of the favorite smells they ever breathed in. It's just something about whether you're running a chainsaw or you're running across the table saw or whatever, and it's like, Yep.
Like,
I kind of feel that way about walnut. I've got a soft spot for walnut.
Do you?
And you'll see that every now and then. But, you run that through a planer or a resaw or something like that. You can definitely smell that. And we've ran and installed several floors that we called a hand-scraped floor. Mm-hmm. And we took a specific tool that just takes kind of a scallop shape out of the floor.
Gotcha.
And it looks like you hit it with a big scrub plane, if you know what that is. It's a big block plane.
Yep.
But instead, the iron isn't square across the end. It's shaped kind of like your fingernail.
Got you.
So it takes a scoop out of the wood.
Yeah.
And so you can do that in a pattern that kind of replicates that. And I tried to do a few boards with an actual scrub plane, and it didn't agree with my shoulders. So
Yeah, I can't imagine doing 1,000 square foot of that.
all day, every day. And the funny thing is, I was transporting some of it one time, and I think a guy at a gas station stopped me and was looking at it, and he was like, thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human history to make a flat board, and you do that to it. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess everybody's got their own opinion about things.
It's just better that way.
Yep. It looks nice. Looks great.
It does.
But
No, I think that's awesome. I mean, I'm fascinated by what you do. I know you get to go into a lot of really cool old buildings, granaries, and just, you get to see the history as it's still standing, and most people don't. Like I can look at a board and can imagine, what type of building it came off of or what purpose it used to serve. And I think that's part of, what's intriguing about looking at it that way. But you actually get to go there and see it still standing a lot of times and be the guy that dismantles it, and which is like, I think I've heard you talk about this before, but it's kind of like when you find an arrowhead, and I saw a post from a farmer friend of mine just like 2 days ago on Facebook, and he was like, it's only the second arrowhead he's ever found, he said, but he was not the type of person necessarily, loved the guy, but he was not the type of person I would have thought that would be like really impressed by an arrowhead, an Indian artifact or whatever you want to call it, just finding just, piece of evidence that there's a society of hunters or whatever that were here way before any white man ever stepped foot on this piece of ground, and there it lies, but it was like stopped him in his tracks, and he just like made this really cool post about it. And it was like, I don't know anybody that finds something like that and doesn't stop for a minute and think about like what it used to be like here, and it rewind the time a little bit. And I think the same about barns. Like you get to go in some of these old barns and imagine, like, because you get to see it still, and it's, the state that it was when somebody put down the hammer or the last, swing of the, I'm going to forget even what the thing's called that they used to hand hewn beams with. It was
broad axe or an adze?
Yes, an adze. Yes, that's what I was thinking. So, what's it like, to go in some of these old buildings? Like, do you get nostalgic?
Oh gosh, yeah.
I would.
It's just, you swim in it. So typically what happens, we'll show up to a barn, and the first thing that has to happen is got to walk around it and make, kind of measure any considerations you have to make to actually get it down. Is the old livestock lot too sloppy to get a telehandler into or get a man lift into and things like that. So somebody will run around the site and just do all that and make sure the utilities are cut off and all that stuff. And my job is usually to go in and draw the frame of the barn and take all the measurements and stuff like that. So I actually get to spend a day
Gotcha.
pretty
Just
much
mapping it out.
uninterrupted. Yeah, just
blueprint.
laying the whole thing out and tagging all the components and everything like that. And that's usually when I get to see the evidence of people in the past. And one of the cool things is, I think I read this in a book called An Age of Barns by Eric Sloan, which I would recommend to anybody that enjoys barns. It's like an encyclopedia on the subject. But oftentimes a barn was the very first thing a family would build when they got to their piece of land, if it was deeded by the government or anything like that. So you can see there's been several where I've gone into a granary and you can see where there was a stovepipe run to the outside of the barn because they lived in the granary the first winter.
Really?
Yeah, before they had anything to put into it.
That's cool.
You know, they might have stored in a couple of the other ones. There's usually 2 or 3, 4 in a barn, but
I've heard that before. I think in that the best way to stay warm in the winter was to stay with the animals because it's just the body heat that your oxen or cattle or horses or whatever would put off.
they put off so much heat and so much moisture that it led to having to whitewash all the areas where the animals were. And so that's another cool thing about some of those like milking barns that you see throughout Ohio. They're just huge. They could be 160 running feet.
What do they whitewash it with? Is just lime?
Barn lime and milk.
Milk.
And the red paint was just rust and iron oxide and milk. Just painted on there.
Yeah, that's why all barns are. We think of barns as red these days. It became the characteristic of a barn was for it to be red.
The original paint, if you can kind of rub your finger on it and it'll come off on your finger and you pinch it, it's just like running your finger down the side of an old rusty truck or something like that. It's pretty neat. It's got that powdery texture to it. But yeah, that whitewash you go in, and a lot of people, gives them a lot of pause. They don't know how to deal with that.
Right.
We got a hot water pressure washer, years and years ago. We had the hot sea salesman roll into our shop, and he had it in the back of his truck, and we're kind of thinking, okay, get out of here, you're wasting our time. We don't need a pressure washer. This
reminds me of a scene from like Secondhand Lions.
Yeah. Except we didn't shoot at him.
Yeah. So pops the trunk open. Look what I got for you.
Yep. So he comes in and he goes, well, do you have anything that's particularly hard to clean? And so I said,
what? No.
Yeah, I've got I've got a whole stack of this stuff that's got, 3/16 to a 1/4 inch of whitewash on it that we just can't do anything with. It's the wood itself is fuzzy, and I've got to dig it off of there with a chisel, and we've got a bunch of it. He said, well, go get a couple pieces. So we brought it over and we set it down on a couple of pieces of dunnage, and we hooked his hot sea up to the water, and he fired it up with the burner on and just melted that whitewash off. And we couldn't throw our money at him fast enough. Just
take my money.
So that's been a real integral part of what we do. We have a lot of customers that contact us and they want gray beams. They want naturally grayed out beams. Well, these beams aren't gray in a barn. They're protected by the siding.
No, they're not supposed to be.
They're
right.
So they're like, well, they've been sitting outside for a while. Just roll them over. Don't wash them. Don't do anything to that. I said, I'm not selling you a beam that I didn't wash, because I wouldn't put a beam that I didn't wash in my own house. It's just, no, we're not doing it. So I'll wash it and then I'll gray it. You're going to have to wait 6 months to get that nice silver to start. And if you want it to start to weather a little bit, it's going to be even longer than that. People are like, we'll just take a plain old brown beam, I guess. So
yeah.
But
it doesn't happen overnight. You don't have just like a giant UV oven that you can put them in. No.
Maybe that's down the road somewhere. But yeah, you can't commercially manufacture this real weathered gray barn
right.
wood.
Yeah.
You can
build yourself a giant beam tanning bed.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically what you would have to do.
Right.
Is just, there's even, we've had people approach us about wanting to do engineered gray board. Where we'll just take this skin off and then we'll laminate it to something behind it, and then you're still only going to get that whatever it is, that 3/16 of an inch piece of the outside of the board that was naturally grayed. The center of the board is going to look brand new once you take that off, so this isn't going to be cost effective for you. They start getting into using the vinegar and the steel wool trick to try and gray it out, but then you just got a flat board that looks gray.
Yeah.
It's actually like the weathering on these behind us that,
right.
It's got all that texture and all that life to it. So that can only happen on the side of a barn.
Yeah, no, for sure. We were talking a little bit about history, pre-civilization there. And I guess taking it back a step, before all these barns went up, I started thinking, like we talked a little bit before we turned on mics here about bison. We're thinking about, okay, these arrowheads and what were they shot at and some of that cool stuff. So then I start thinking about, my mind always goes back to bison. I'm kind of just infatuated with them. That's kind of why they're, our theme animal, or they're our spirit animal here at Landry Ground. Because to us, it's a species that represents early American history. I mean, it ties, the land to the people who lived here and the people who, moved here and began to, break ground and build these barns and do all that cool stuff with it. But this is something else that you've become known for. Like I've heard you in several interviews and talking about it, and I know that you're like you have vast knowledge about these things that like this is why I find you as like one of these really interesting people to talk with, because like you can go down a lot of rabbit holes with Judd McCullum. Yep. And they're all cool. They're all pretty fun and interesting. But so most people who know your name will probably remember that like you're the guy that found the big old mastodon tusk, right?
Yep.
But tell us a little bit more about that if you want to, and then I guess just tell us about. I mean, I don't know. I want to hear about this like megafauna, the critters that used to roam right here where we're sitting right now that like most people have never even heard of or that don't realize. You can still go find some of this stuff, right?
Yep. They're all over the place. They're right past the ends of your boots.
That's nuts.
It's nuts. And I've got a piece out in the truck I should have brought in to show you, but it's just you have to always wonder if something could be something. Like I was just out planting a field out here today in the last few days, and every time I see something white and shiny, I got to jump off because I just know it's Burlington chert. And so I've been finding a bunch of scrapers, a bunch of broken projectile points, stuff like that.
Cool.
So I will start this off by saying you have to be curious about what it is you're walking over.
Sure.
Not necessarily on flat ground, because this stuff is down pretty deep. So especially in creeks, like you had mentioned, if you're walking down a creek, they're the great aggregators of history. You know, they're cutting down to that base level as far as they can go, bedrock in some cases.
You don't think about rocks and bones and stuff moving much, but it all does over time.
It all does.
It all goes downhill pretty much too.
I have found marine fossils above beer cans. You know, it's just, you cannot underestimate the power of flowing water.
Huh.
You can't. And for the same reasons, you can't trust where you find something to tell you how old something is.
Good point.
Because it could just get all tumbled, and it's really fun to think about. But yeah, I've got this piece out in my truck that I actually picked up while I was turkey hunting, and I looked at it and I thought, it's just a rock, you know. And I actually did pick it up and look at it, and I set it back down in the same place I found it, and went back. Almost a year later. It was during shed season. I had a buddy come over and we were walking down there, and I looked down and it was still there. And I was like, that's not just a rock, that's a bone. Definitely. And I picked it up and I kind of washed it off in the creek, and I really kicked myself for setting it back down, because it has all the structures you want to see. You want to see like the bone marrow. If it's got a break in it, you can see that porous structure.
Yeah. A little honeycomb kind of.
Yeah. You can see the polished ends where the joints were working against each other and stuff like that. And I was pretty ashamed of myself, but I set that back down, and now it's been riding around in the cup holder of my truck for a couple of months, and I still haven't identified what it is. But
it's cool. So I've never found anything really cool like that, which, you know, I would like to hear, you know, what that's like to find something like that. But the last guy that sat in this chair is a good friend of mine, Garrett Fike, and he several years back was hiking through one of our local creeks here and found an antler and picked it up, and it was the burr end and a broken brow tine and a chunk of elk antler about this long. Now, we haven't had elk here since I think like the 1840s, somewhere in that time frame.
There,
and it, you know, so doesn't mean that it's 1,000 years old. I mean, it could just be 200 and you know, 300 or something years old. But just the fact that like it's not fossil, it's bone.
Not fossil.
It's just a chunk of shed antler. It is actually a shed, not like skull cap. And it's just wild that, you know, he's just walking down a creek and saw something like, and he probably, when he first saw it, either thought it was, you know, a cow bone, or thought that it was, you know, a deer antler but once you pick it up, it's like, oh, holy cow. Even though there's only that much of it, you know, it's a very telltale shape that that's elk, and there's no mistaking it.
For sure,
Pretty cool to find that in Illinois or Iowa or someplace here close. But
yeah, a buddy of mine, Mitch Gleason, found an elk shed that was just standing right up against a brush pile, like somebody put it there, just down near Lincoln, Illinois.
Wow.
Just perfect. Very minimal chewing on it. It had to have fallen off in that creek into the mud somewhere that was anaerobic. And it was so well preserved, it looked like it fell off yesterday. And it probably wasn't a fossil. It was probably only a few hundred years old, but it's just the shape that an antler can get into after a couple of seasons in the wrong conditions.
To me, I don't mean to discredit or say that I'm not interested when somebody finds like a dinosaur fossil, something that's like a bone or tooth or something that is, really, really old that has completely mineralized and became a rock.
Yep.
But I think it's just amazes me when you find a skull or a leg bone or, some part of an animal that's only a few hundred years old that like those don't exist anymore.
Yep.
And the fact that like not only did they walk here, but it really wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't that long ago. It wasn't. Like from the mammoth, the tusk that I found, the bone associated with the jaw isn't mineral replaced. It's still bone. So it really doesn't fall under the purview of paleontology or geology or anything like that. It's it's called quaternary geology, which is kind of a gray area, which is kind of fun, but it's not concrete because all this stuff is redeposited material from glaciers. So it's kind of a big guessing game. It just adds to the fun of it.
What county or what part of Illinois was that in?
So I found the mammoth in Logan County, the geographic center of Illinois. And the creeks down there, it's got a topography that's similar to eastern Iowa, around, I'd say, just west of the Quad Cities, Muscatine. It's kind of a sort of some rolling hills. And there's the terminal moraine of the glacier where the glacier stopped and pushed up a whole bunch of till about 5 miles north of where I found this. And the creeks just cut really deep and really wide. And they don't necessarily run deep most of the year. They might only be a couple feet of water, and kind of like the Wapsie there in Iowa. But they're just uncovering a huge amount of gravel that was original. It would have been the original landscape before the glaciers pushed up all this dirt and all this rock flour settled out of the atmosphere. So that's where
rock flour.
Sorry,
I had to stop for a minute on that term. I love that.
Yeah, that's our, I think, top three soil horizons was settled out of the atmosphere, and then the prairies built the soil on top of it. So
cool,
as I understand it.
Yes, yep.
But so yeah, to just walk down these big broad creeks. There's 2, 3, 4 of them. Sangamon River's the same way in places. If you just have a curiosity about what you could be looking at, you could find absolutely anything.
Yeah, as
evidenced by John Waller traveling down Sugar Creek and finding one of the better ground sloth skulls, I think that is known.
Now, Sugar Creek, is this like down, we're talking about like Browning area, or what part of what county?
Sugar Creek runs from a little bit east of Bloomington, toward the southwest, and runs into the Sangamon River down south of Middleton somewhere, if I'm not mistaken.
Gotcha.
But it's kind of, Kickapoo Creek's right in there too, and there's a Kickapoo Creek on the east side of the Illinois River and one on the west side of the Illinois River, and they hit the river at not that far apart, so that can be confusing as well. But.
So he found a ground sloth skull. Mm-hmm. How big is that? Like, what is it? Like a bear skull, basically, or a bit bigger?
14, 15 inches long, I'd say.
Yeah. And
it's really boxy, or super boxy looking.
Describe what a ground sloth is to people who never heard of this kind of critter before. I mean, is it like I imagine it like a giant wombat.
Pretty much.
Like a beaver almost head.
Almost like a beaver. You could picture a beaver with just a big kind of meaty tail. They're super heavy boned animal. Really small eyes based on how their skulls put together.
The orbital socket.
Yep. And there's little to no zygomatic arch on them, as far as like you might see on a deer skull sticking out the sides. It's just a really peculiar looking thing, and it's a wonder that John even put together that it was from an animal. Like I actually wonder how long he probably stood there and looked at it, and how many times he almost walked away from the thing, because when you see it, it doesn't look like it should be inside of an animal's head. It's just so bizarre. Where you would think the eyes are, it's not where they go. Where you just first look at it, I'll share some pictures with you so you can put them up.
Wild.
But, so yeah, just a great big animal, super heavy bones, probably had a lot of hair on it.
Do you know what they ate or what they like? Anything else about this?
Probably anything that they could reach or knock over or knock down.
Yeah,
So
it's an herbivore, but it's
an herbivore. Yep. Probably woody browse. Definitely woody browse based on the structure of the teeth. So when John first contacted me, him and Mitch were like, "Hey, we found a giant beaver skull. This is pretty cool. Check this out." And I looked at it and I said, "I got bad news for you. It's not a giant beaver skull." And they're like, "What? Well, it's got to be." And I said, "It's not, but it's something cooler. It's a sloth skull. It's a ground sloth skull." And so I told them how they knew that. Well, if you look at a beaver skull, obviously its incisors are right together, and they've got iron inclusion in them, so they're usually just bright orange. With a lot of large rodents are like that. But when you look at the front of this, it's got a big cleft from the nasal passage down to its incisors. And I said, it's got a big old prehensile lip that worked in conjunction with probably a great big tongue, and they just used that as a
stripping leaves,
third hand stripping leaves, pulling limbs down. I mean, it's a sloth, so it has these great big hooked claws that you probably just reach over and pull a tree down and eat whatever it wants off of it and let it go, and then move on to the next thing and just do that its entire life and be a menace on the landscape.
It's the coolest thing to me, to think about these giant mammals that roamed all over right here that you can still find bones from or whatever that used to eat these trees. Now that like some of these species that we think about like soft mass producers or hard mass producers, and we think about the reason that trees develop certain characteristics like hard mast or soft mast or whatever is for seed distribution. They're producing a fruit or nut or whatever to feed a specific critter that will help then disperse it or cache the nuts and bury them or whatever, so that the tree, like that's its mechanism for reproduction and seed distribution and whatever. But then there's some of these species that like, what the heck is eating that? And so I like, even as a kid, kind of some of these head scratchers, you think about like, well, mulberries are obvious, okay, there's tons of birds today, and every raccoon pile of scat you've ever seen is loaded with mulberry, seeds. Didn't seem to matter what time of year it is. There's just always mulberries in coon crap. I don't know why, but so there's, certain species of trees like that just make sense. Like, okay, all the animals around here seem to, and then I've talked to you about this before, but like, you look at a honey locust or a tree like that has needles, thorns on it, 12, 14 inches long, some of them, and all the way up the whole trunk of the tree. It makes no sense. And, and like, what was that tree afraid of?
And then you start looking at your ground sloths and your mastodons that are just out there pushing things over and taking what they want from them and moving on. Well, that honey locust developed here, have this pod, take that. But leave me alone.
Yeah. Here, let me drop that way out there
way
for
out
you.
There, stay away from me.
You do your thing.
And hedge trees, to an
me
extent. Hedge trees are a mean, tangled thing. But, they were putting their fruit out there. Here, eat this, take this, and leave me alone.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
These giant, foamy, green, sticky, nasty things that, like, squirrels, will have their way with the hedge ball these days, but there's nothing else that really eats that. Like,
not too much. Unless it gets real nasty out, the deer might get into it a little bit.
They really got to rot first and get softened up before a deer wants anything to do with it. But yeah, I think that stuff is amazing. And so it's like, it's a cool piece of history and part of the, American landscape that we just, I think 99% of people who live here and grew up here don't know anything about that stuff.
Yeah, they just look out for it and try to keep it out of their eyes when they're out mushroom hunting or whatever, Here's another fun one, and it doesn't have to do with megafauna, but it has to do with fending off prairie as the landscape changed. Walnuts put a toxin into the ground.
Juglone.
Yep, and it keeps big blue stem away.
Yeah.
And if you know anything about big blue stem, there's not much that keeps it away.
No, and but suppresses plants like that so that it doesn't get enveloped in prairie and then eventually burned off. It is cool. It is really, really cool. And so juglone, there's only a few plant species that are really juglone tolerant. So you have like persimmons, eastern red cedar, a few others like that. But like, that's why you see walnuts typically grow in groves, because once they've pumped enough juglone into the soil, good luck trying to.
Not much is coming up.
Yeah,
and what does isn't very deeply rooted.
We planted a tree. This is kind of a humbling confession. several years ago, probably 6-8 years ago. Brought home a couple of trees. Thought that a couple of them were pecans, and I'm pretty sure that a couple of them were. And we planted some of them. Planted one right next to the garden. Well, it was a black walnut.
Yep.
I let the thing grow for a good 5-6 years before all of a sudden I looked at it one summer day and I'm like, those are walnuts. That is not a pecan tree. I just convinced myself that it was, and so it just kept growing. And it's literally right next to Jackie's garden. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really pretty black walnut tree that I've been growing for the last 6 years. Yep. Now I have to kill it. Yep. So it got hit with the chainsaw. But anyway, it is cool. Some of these plants that, that we still have around here that basically were either designed or developed or if you believe that they evolved that way or whatever, however they came to be, they were part of a symbiotic relationship with wildlife or with other plants that now the whole cycle is kind of incomplete. Part of the puzzle is missing.
Yep.
So it's amazing, that's just evidence, though, to look at some of those types of things and say oh, well, this really, this didn't happen by accident. This tree or whatever served a purpose, and it was part of a bigger picture, and now you can really start to see what the rest of the picture was.
Yep.
Pretty cool stuff.
It is.
I want to shift gears entirely for just a couple more minutes here and hear more about you personally, and tell me, I feel like from our conversations that we're birds of a feather. We share a lot of similar viewpoints. And so I want to hear your thoughts on just land ownership in general, and kind of let's talk a little bit about what that means to you. Where are you guys at with, your own kind of land journey, or you have some family ground? I know that we've talked about a little bit before, and any of that you want to get into.
So, yeah. So, growing up, my family had quite a bit of ground in Pike County, and it was farmed. They ran hogs in the timber. They did all kinds of stuff. It was a big part of our family. In the early 90s, when land prices started to rise, and my grandfather and his siblings were in their later years, they decided they didn't want any part of that anymore. And so they started to have disagreements. My grandpa wanted to keep farming. His other siblings had moved away, and they had designs on, financial gain. And so they all fought and squabbled and all got lawyers together. And all those lawyers played golf with each other, and they came out the other end with very little. So that has always loomed pretty large in my life. I believe having land is something that has to be talked about regularly. It has to be an integral part of life as a family. It has to be, right at the top of the mind all the time, or you're going to start having those detachments and things like that. And that's what's going to lead to splitting up something you've worked so hard for.
Yeah, or multi-generational.
Yeah, it just dismantles the whole thing so fast. It
kind of goes back to the barns in Europe that are still there 500 or 600 or 700 years later, because somebody was intentional about teaching that next generation why it was important.
Yep. And it goes back to being maybe the teaching wasn't the best, and it created some sort of a distaste where the people wanted to separate themselves from as soon as they could. Maybe the kids were overworked on the farm or something like that. Which probably happened a lot. But that brings me to today. About not today, about 14 years ago, I started dating my now wife, Carly, and I think we dated for a year, and then I started to work for her dad, Barnstormers Wood. And I kind of got my feet back under me and started thinking about, deer hunting and recreating again. And, I was in a better financial place than I had been. And so I started talking. I started getting my trail cameras out, and I started doing this and that. And she's like, well, what's going on? What's this new interest in being outside? And I realized I'd had my nose to the grindstone for so long that she didn't actually know who I was outside of work and going to dinner and spending time together.
It was just a part of your life that
Yeah,
you didn't feel you had that chapter closed for very long, but apparently it just wasn't something she had seen before.
Yeah, in those couple of years. And so I started talking about, I've got to go back and I've got to revisit some of the farmers I used to hunt on, see if if they've leased out and this and that and the other thing. At one point I was telling you I had tree stands in 4 or 5 counties in western Illinois during the outfitter boom, which everybody was, kind of, it's a mean way to put it, but belly aching that they didn't have the ground to hunt that they grew up on. It's a reality.
Yeah.
But, I just made myself available to help all year round. And, I was able to get on a lot of this ground. And so I started talking about doing that. She said, well, why don't you go ask my grandpa if he can hunt the farm? I was like, the farm? Interesting. Okay. So she led me into breakfast one Sunday morning by the nose and sat me down and I said, don't you have a question for him? I asked him and he said, well, yeah, there's X amount of acres here. I'm sure you could find a tree to hide in if you wanted to. And so that started my journey on her family's ground. And it took me 8 years to propose to her for some reason, but now
you found out her family owned a whole bunch of ground and it still took you 8 years.
Yeah, it still took me 8 years. I wanted her to be good and sure that I was what she wanted. This
is a testament to the fact that like you're a man of character, because a lesser man might have dropped to one knee pretty fast.
Yeah, I'm surprised somebody didn't find her in the plat book, to be honest with you. But so that all went down, and that began my journey onto this farm, or this bunch of farms that, for better or for worse, the crop fields advanced technologically, but the rest of the farm, the livestock operation, the timber, that sort of management sort of stopped in the 50s.
Okay.
I guess. Yeah. And it was adapted to the livestock. I came in thinking I was a hot shot and I could read a book, and there's a bunch of things that needed to be done better. But when you step back and look at it, they were actually doing good things for the land, turning the cows out onto the fields after the crops are harvested and things like that, getting all that manure worked in, breaking up the residue and all that stuff. And it just took me a long time to realize I don't know everything. And once I kind of got into that mind space, I settled into being curious about what was out there. And that led me into kind of getting past just the deer and the turkeys. Yeah. And I've always been interested in wildlife, but, being able to have that kind of relationship with land. And to a point, you start getting to know individual animals by things other than their antlers.
Yeah.
Is this squirrel lives in this tree. There's a red-tailed hawk that's lived in this tree for a few years. There's an eagle's nest down by the river.
Yep.
And they've been there X amount. And you start to recognize that these animals and their patterns. And you get to kind of a point where here in Illinois, you run into a wall where, you might not see mink that often, things like that. That's interesting to see. But as far as animals go, there's not a huge variety, I guess, as compared to some other places. So that led me into plants. Yeah. And you start really digging into plants, and my gosh, that's just a can of worms. And as I mentioned, the management and the timbers kind of stopped. So there's only a couple of spots on some of the farms that have been logged. And that creates, diversity of habitat, stuff like that. But there's just an amazing amount of special variety. As far as like spring ephemerals and all the plants that grow. Like a lot of people on their ground don't know plants because they don't have them.
Right.
They've got a bunch of bush honeysuckle on a hillside, and then they've got just a sea of nettle down on maybe their bottom ground, and they don't go into that because nobody likes walking through chest-high nettle. Right. And there's just really nothing to look at outside of being in there for turkey season and mushroom hunting.
And there are pluses and negatives both to like running livestock on some more like timber ground or native types of habitat. I mean, you can use some of those things as a management technique. And so I'm not, I guess I want to be clear about that before I just badmouth it. And that's the only part of this conversation somebody heard. But there are a lot of bodies of timber that in say like the 30s through the 80s, people fenced and put hogs on, and to some extent cattle also. I mean, you can overgraze it or, too many head, too longer duration or whatever. But hogs, especially running livestock like that in wooded ground, especially because it's just really they root, they dig things up and whatever. And it depleted a lot of the natural diversity that was there. And so then when you pull hogs off of it,
It's not there.
what fills in those voids that they created was, more of the plants that either the hogs left alone or stuff that just grew really aggressively and fast and filled in the voids.
Yep.
So we lost a lot of that diversity. The plants that are here, there still is amazing, variety, as you put it, of different species. But is this like kind of what led you down the path that now you're kind of like, now you are a dealer, right? For a native seed distributor. And so like you're kind of, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So, which we're big fans of Hoxie also, but so it was no surprise to me when they said, yeah, we got a new dealer, and they told me who it was. And I was like, that's awesome.
That checks out.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
A lot of people said that. So the short story on this is years ago, I have a buddy that talked into his Instagram stories all the time. He went through his whole day of woodworking, and his name's Jeff Himstead out of Peoria area, and he's a phenomenal woodworker, but he's kind of given up on the daily stories. But I picked up on that. Yeah. And I've been trying to spread that message, like people need to do this so you can see what you're doing in your own life. So I did that, probably since 2017, just talking into my phone and telling stories, and people have been getting to know me and getting to know, some of the different peculiar things about the farm and how it runs. And so, there's a few spots that I go back to and talk about, but it just turned into, they call it a brand. I guess I've got a personal brand that I created by talking into my phone like a crazy person for the last 7 years. And, my wife just thought I was a nut doing it. And it's just now finally starting to pick up to where people are like, hey, it's that guy. And I watch his stories and I learn stuff from him. And, I'll walk around the Iowa Deer Classic and people are like, hey, it's, hi, how you doing? I love your stories. And I don't know how to take compliments. So I'm like, oh gosh, it's,
don't make it weird.
Kind of freeze up, and I do make it weird almost every time. I'm ashamed of how I am in person as compared to how I am sort of publicly on podcasts and in my stories. I just don't know how to deal with people because I've spent my whole life in the woods. But so that kind of led me to Kent Boucher and Nick Lirio getting a hold of me and saying, hey, we want you to be a dealer in Illinois. Yeah. And so at that point, I think I had identified some cut plant, and I've had this sort of long relationship learning about compass plant and things like that. I really love silphiums. But I was like, I can learn this. I can do this. Yeah. So what do? I run around to every bookstore within driving distance here and grab everything I can about native flowers and native plants. And growing up, if I wasn't outside, I was in a library or trying to learn something. So it was a weird thing. I had kind of an eidetic memory. Like I can still remember pages in books from when I was a kid and where they were in the books and the pictures on them, the text, the subtext underneath, everything. But I got hit in the head by a baseball my senior year in high school, and it kind of went away. Oh, so I still try to pick up.
You were gonna say like that's what led to all of this, and I was no, that's an odd superhero genesis story.
It took it down about 80%, so I still got a little bit of this. So I can still pick up a book and thumb through it and remember where things are at, but I can't like remember whole pages of text. Yeah. So I tried doing that. I tried going through the books, and I tried looking at the pictures, and I tried memorizing stuff. And they had contacted me probably in May or June of that year, and I spent the whole summer looking at these books, and like nothing's sticking in my brain. And finally, all these plants started coming out of bloom and going to seed, and that's when I started putting things together. Like, oh, I found evening primrose. It grows here along this road, down this gravel road, and then I watched it go out of bloom, and I watched it go to seed, and I watched the pods split open, and it was like that for so many different species. And so I ordered up a bunch of these little cannabis bags off of Amazon, and as all these seeds came ripe, I'd gather, a third to a half of them, throw them in these bags, label where I found it in as much detail as I possibly could, put a date on it, and then throw them in the bed of my truck underneath the topper so that they could cold stratify or whatever naturally and be protected from rodents and all that stuff. And that just being able to see them on the landscape and being able to identify, the different markers of, when they're going to come up, what they're going to come up next to, what they get along with sort of. And that's really how I learned all this stuff. And so I've been telling everybody that asks me about the prairie seed and about the pollinator and all that stuff. I was like, I want to be able to tell you everything about this without having to go to Nick and Kent or some other source. I want to be able to tell you this myself before I promote it, because I'm not in this for the dollar. I mean, money's nice and everything, but the land is the legacy. So putting all this seed there, whether it's the end of the world tomorrow or, mankind goes for the rest of recorded history, where I'm going to have that seed on the land to be ready to do its thing and propagate itself.
It's stewardship,
Yes.
whether you're a godly person, somebody who believes that there's a grand creator and all of that sort of thing, like we are, but still there's, people, you don't necessarily have to feel like you were bestowed this responsibility to take care of land, to just have a love for land and just natural things and wildlife and plants, and just say, like, it's pretty fragile, and it's pretty easy for us to come in and interrupt the natural system of things and screw it up. So, like, you should all feel this responsibility to be the caretaker that, that says we have a duty and a responsibility to make sure that this fragile ecosystem of, all these beautiful flowers and these pollinator insects and all this stuff that all works in harmony, we got to make sure that stuff sticks. And if there's any small thing that some of us could do that helps propagate these species or ensures for generations that they're going to be around, then I don't know why we shouldn't do it.
Exactly.
So I love it. I love that we share that passion about it, and I just think it's really cool. You are an outstanding spokesperson, in my opinion. You can just shut up for a minute, because I know you just said you don't know how to take a compliment. You are an outstanding spokesperson for, like, our culture, our American history, and the part that, like, the native flora play in that. And I think I'm super stoked that you are the one of the people that's going to be, like, helping promote that by offering that and selling native seed to people, because they need to hear and, like, buy it from an expert. But also, it's just, you have to have a passion for it, because, like you said, none of us are going to get wealthy doing this stuff. It's not, we don't do it for the money. We don't, do land management stuff for the money. You do it because you're passionate about it, because it's something that you want, And so anyway, long story short, if anybody's listening to this and thinking about prairie seed, it's a great source for it, and they should get it from somebody that's sitting here talking about it, because like, these are, just prairie is one of our favorite things. So with land your ground in general, people who appreciate what the landscape used to be, whether that's because they love our productive soils and, the benefits that we have now of farming it and all of that, but they still need to, like, think about, keeping some part of their landscape in natives. Whether that's, just filter strips that have native grasses in it, or they have a pollinator plot somewhere on their property. I mean, it's just something that deserves that spot on the landscape and should not be expunged or erased from it. So, well, Judd, as we land the plane here on the end of this episode, you got any final thoughts or anything that you want to leave our viewers with and our audience? I mean, we hit a lot of cool subjects today. What's the take home, you think?
The take home, I would say, is just be curious about what's around you. Just pay attention to what you're stepping over, what you're close to all the time. I would encourage everybody to get the Seek app by iNaturalist on their phones. It'll tell you just about what everything alive around you is. It's a great jumping off point to, stoke the fire of a curiosity about the natural world if you happen to have it. And if you see a cool rock, pick it up, take a picture of it, send it to somebody at your state museum that might be able to tell you what it is. There's people out there to answer these questions. You just have to do a little bit of looking to find out who they might be. And if it's reaching out to your local university extension office, you can do that. You can even contact me. I'm pretty good at identifying a lot of different things. So
right on. And what's the best way for people to reach out to your contacts? We'll tag you in socials and stuff here in the description. But
my Instagram is probably the best way. If you want to contact Hoxie about any seed or anything you might have heard me mention, bring up my name to them. Makes me look good. I don't do much on Facebook. I'll just let everybody know that I'm just there for the working class bow hunter admin duties that I do. So
right on. You do a fine job of that. Yep, we love that group as well.
Yep.
All right, guys. Well, Appreciate everybody dialing in here today and joining us for this episode with Judd McCullum. And we will see you next time on Land Your Ground.